Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast of St. Louis on the Air, brought to you by University College at Washington University, with undergraduate and graduate programs part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. 20 years ago, one of the more colorful media personalities in St. Louis lost his life in a way that drips with irony. It was helicopter crash for Allen Barklage. Helicopters were his life and ultimately his death. The public knew him as a St. Louis traffic reporter. That's just part of the story. And that story is being told in the Riverfront Times. It's titled The Legend of Allen Barklage, and the reporter is Danny Wicentowski. He joins us in studio. Danny, great to have you with us.
Great to be here.
You've brought back a lot of memories for many media people who have been around St. Louis for a lot of time, myself included. What drew you to the Allen Barklage story?
You know, it's its own convoluted kind of story, of course. I came to the area in 2013, and shortly after that, I was researching a short piece that was written by one of my colleagues, Sam Levin, about someone who was selling a homemade jetpack on the internet. This led me to someone who had known Allen Barklage, and this source ended up not being part of any story, but he did tell me this incredible story about his friend who had, survived all of this. This drama, this hijacking attempt, killing a woman mid-air and then dying in this helicopter accident. And it was filled with so much drama and tragedy and, a figure that sounded something close to a superhero. And so I just kept being fascinated with it. And eventually my interest in Allen Barklage actually led me to one of the hijackers who was trying to escape prison in 1978. That became its own story, but I always wanted to put something together about Allen and that he deserved sort of a full, comprehensive accounting of a remarkable life. And so I'm glad I could finally do that. Yeah,
it's fascinating reading. And his heroics started long before St. Louis. I mean, he was in Vietnam and was lucky to get out of that alive.
That's very true. Talking with his older brother, Larry, who was also in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot, not in Vietnam, he flew around there, but a friend of his, Gene Hoffmeyer, another Vietnam pilot. This was an extremely dangerous thing to be doing. About a quarter of the flight school, 300 people died in these, and Barklage was said to have crashed multiple times. Photos in his scrapbook just kind of show him standing next to the wreckage of these helicopters, smiling. And it was a smile that I think a lot of people ended up seeing here in St. Louis, but that's really where it got its start, that heroism.
And the basis of your research, what kind of a guy was he, just very, very generally?
Everyone I've talked to about him said that he had this running sort of self-aware sense of humor, both about what he did in a helicopter, the danger of it, and this sort of full-throated confidence that he had. I think those who were close to him got to see sort of a more nuanced version of that, but this was someone who was very comfortable behind a mic, piloting a helicopter while doing reporting, and so he had this larger-than-life persona and a sense of fun that he seemed to really try to convey to those around him, even if it meant, putting someone in his helicopter and say, by the way, hold on, and just diving that thing, right at the ground.
Well, or the water. Let's tell that story because it's one of those that most people who were around at the time certainly remember, and that was the rescue of a potential suicide. Tell the story.
Right. I had come across that story. KSDK had, their coverage of that. He was their helicopter. He flew for KSDK Channel 5. And that video still lives online. And so there was a man who, parked his car on the Poplar Street Bridge, got out, got on the edge, and was sort of literally being held onto by two police officers who were trying to keep him from jumping. And Allen Barklage was in his helicopter flying over this scene, and he had gotten the same report from the ground. The man falls, and Allen Barklage, dives the helicopter and hovers it, only a few feet above the water. Off-duty O'Fallon police officer named Jim Cavins was in the back and actually got out of his seat, crouched on the landing gear, and hoisted this guy onto the skid. The man holds on. He's exhausted, though, and as they take off, he falls yet again. And Allen Barklage performs this move that a lot of people describe to me that just this immediate flip of the helicopter to turn, just a very fast 180, which I'm told is a very, very difficult maneuver that he would just pull off like he was wiping his nose. Cavens hoist this guy back onto the skid, and there are these images that were captured by some TV news crews of just this man holding on to the skid of a helicopter about 5-10 feet above the water, and he saved his life.
The story is remarkable, and they dropped the man off on a barge.
Yes,
nearby.
The man was safe. He dropped the man off. He managed to get him to a safe area where he was, recovered and was safe.
The story, as I started to say, is remarkable and for many reasons, not the least of which is the courage and the confidence that you mentioned. Had that skid touched the water, the helicopter would have been down and all would have been lost.
Yeah, people don't, I certainly didn't realize. I've never flown a helicopter, but a helicopter is if you think about a car is running on a controlled explosion and a helicopter is running on just a controlled spin, that is, hopefully everything is counterbalancing themselves, and certainly he just in his own exploits, the amount of danger that comes into pushing a helicopter and trying to avoid even the smallest error or smallest piece of damage can be catastrophic to a helicopter.
Yeah. Let's talk about the other story that got so much attention, and you alluded to it a little while ago, talking about the hijacker. Let's pick it up with how he became involved in this at all.
I think like a lot of Allen Barklage stories, he was in the right place at perhaps the wrong time, but he was the right person for that situation. He'd been working for a company called Foster Helicopters, and they did a lot of commercial flights, and this was 1978. Woman had reserved a charter flight to, ostensibly look at some flooded property around Cape Girardeau, the Cape, and he, 30 minutes into the flight, she pulls out a pistol, yanks out the cord on his headset and says, "We're flying east, and we're going to go pick up a man named Garrett Trapnell and 2 other people." Garrett Trapnell was someone that she'd only met in person a month before, according to the prison records, but she had fallen in love with this man who was a convicted airline hijacker, and was someone who used particularly women, having married multiple women, robbed multiple banks, and really did whatever he wanted as far as getting out of prisons. That was what he was known for, and she fell for him. For whatever reason, we'll never really be able to ask her, because as they get over the prison, Allen Barklage, as he would later recount to investigators, he comes to the calculation in his mind that at some point, if he goes through with this, the guards in the prison are going to shoot him.
He was being told to land inside the prison walls.
Yeah, and the map that she carried with her had a literal X on the yard where he was to land. But this was, he was a pilot who had already faced gunfire from the ground, and he knew how easy it would be. And he also knew that the guards were thinking, if they take out the pilot, this escape isn't going to happen. And so he tells her, as they're, positioning themselves over the prison, to open the door while they're in the air. It was a very heavy sliding door. Whether this was true or not from a technical standpoint, I can't say. But as she's doing this, she moves the pistol to her left hand, and she takes her finger off the trigger. And he turns around, he completely disengages with the controls, and he grabs the pistol out of her hand. And then he turns back around to make sure that...
To continue flying the helicopter.
The helicopter is at that point, if you were... An uncontrolled helicopter is not the thing you want. It is just a spinning catastrophe without someone holding on to it. And he notices that she is reaching into the briefcase that she had brought with her. That briefcase is filled with guns that are meant for the prisoners. And according to Barklage, she says something like, "It doesn't matter, I have another." And he then fires, he pulls the trigger 5 times. 1 is a misfire. 3 bullets strike her, 1 through the head. And according to accounts, he is just wildly shooting, and he blows out one of his own windows. He then again turns back around to control this helicopter and lands, not on the X where he was supposed to.
Outside the wall.
Yeah. Well, he lands next to an administrative building, which is within, there are several additional fences between now him and the prisoners who are... the prisoners who are waiting there don't actually see the helicopter, but they can hear the engine cut off, and they don't see the helicopter where it's supposed to be. And that's when, the aftermath begins.
Right. Well, he regretted the fact that he killed this woman for the rest of his life. He had actually hoped that that would not have been the case.
It's very true, and I think it is sort of the two parts of him, where on one hand, I think to those he was closest to, he expressed the desire that this didn't have to happen this way. Perhaps if he could have talked her out of it, which he said he tried to do, that. And that he wished that, his wife told me, his wife at the time, that he'd always wished the newspaper articles that were written later, which were all heroics and all, kind of that wonderful kind of tabloid style that existed in a way in some of these events, that he wished they could have said that he didn't mean to kill her, that this was not what he'd wanted.
He did, years later, he did interviews with KSDK television, and we have one clip here of him talking about his reaction to that prison escape situation.
I would say the dominating thought that I have when I think back on that is there may have been a way to do that without shooting a person.
That still bothers you?
Right. Was there a way I could have done it? Could I have talked her out of it?
Well, that didn't happen, obviously, but he did have his regrets, needless to say. In that same interview with KSDK, he also made reference to the rescue on the Mississippi River. Let's hear what he had to say about that.
I consider myself lucky to be in that position at that time, to be able to do that. As it turned out, if in fact we saved a person's life, thank God for that. We did it.
Allen Barklage, a 1991 interview with KSDK. Let's again talk a little bit more about the man, because all of these heroics and all of these interesting things that he was involved in are just great stories, but he was also pretty active in the community as well.
It's true. He, with his status as sort of local media celebrity, which was really something that mattered, in the 70s and 80s when he did a lot of his work. He was appearing at fundraisers and charities. Looking through the newspaper archives, you would find his name popping up in sort of, see Allen Barklage in the yellow jet copter, at whatever car dealership he was at. He was really, really active, and the stations that he was a part of really, trying to leverage that familiarity. But I also talked with people, he would show up at schools. He would, meet school children. And these were memories that people would have, years later. My own colleague, Daniel Hill, who you spoke with, actually sat in Allen Barklage's helicopter as a child when he stopped by a Hardee's. As an aside, that particular Hardee's, I believe, which is near St. Charles, was where Barklage would just land his helicopter after the traffic run. He was certainly known for just turning up wherever he wanted with his helicopter, which was sort of the delight of that vehicle for him.
Easy to do with a helicopter, much more so than with other things I can think of. Okay, you've also written about another person involved in the Allen Barklage story and involved in this so-called prison break down in Marion, and that's Martin McNally, who was another hijacker like Trapnell, and he was involved in a hijacking here in St. Louis in 1972.
Right. The various characters of this story certainly don't make for an easy telling in one spot, but Martin McNally, as you'd mentioned, hijacked a plane out of Lambert in 1972, hoping to mimic the successful sort of hijacking and robbery that was sort of trademarked by a man named D.B. Cooper. And essentially, you would hijack a plane, you would demand a ransom, you would then have the plane go back up into the air, jump out with a parachute, and disappear. He almost got it all right, except when he jumped out, he had never used a parachute before. And when he jumped out, the force of pulling the parachute dislodged the bag of money that contained about $500,000, and the last he ever saw of it was it disappearing into the clouds. That money was later found by a soybean farmer in Peru, Indiana, and was returned. McNally actually now lives in St. Louis. He was paroled in 2010 after 37 years in various maximum security prisons. His story is quite interesting, but one of the things when I began to interview him was just this sense of awareness and regret of what he and Garrett Trapnell had done to the Oswald family. And in many ways, McNally is not a picture of regret over his previous life. This was someone who was very decisive, who did what he wanted, who wanted to escape for a reason, who wanted to rob a plane for a reason. But I think now, he's now in his early 70s. The manipulation of Barbara Oswald, promising her a life that she didn't have. These were letters that Trapnell was writing her. McNally was sort of in on it and encouraging this. And of course, there is a double tragedy to that family as well, in that Robin Oswald, Barbara's daughter, incredibly hijacked an additional plane in 1979 on the day that Trapnell and McNally were to be, the jury verdict was returned. The 17-year-old teenager, the daughter of Barbara Oswald, gets on a plane in St. Louis toward Kansas City, and 5 minutes before it lands, she reveals what she claimed were dynamite, but were actually road flares, and creates this entire second drama. And for Allen Barklage, to return to him, this was, I think, deeply painful. And his wife said that when he ended up getting a call from the FBI, that woman who you shot in the helicopter, her daughter is now hijacking another plane, he immediately offered himself as a hostage, as an exchange. And he thought that this trauma that he had caused was now coming back to him, and he would have some responsibility. Robin didn't take him up on that offer, and that hijacking was eventually resolved peacefully, and she was arrested and I think released after being in a juvenile institution. But again, Allen Barklage's life just kept intersecting with these incredible moments, and those who are still around who remember them, Martin McNally, who now is living with these memories of crime, and those who remember Allen Barklage, I think everyone I've talked to are just sort of still astounded just to think that one person lived through all of this stuff.
You can't make this stuff up. I mean, this is truth is stranger than fiction. I happened to be at the Lambert Airport that night and was there for many hours when McNally was.
Oh my gosh!
And I think people who were around then will remember this, and that was that there was a fellow who was listening to the traffic in a bar across the street from the airport, who was so incensed by what was going on as the FBI was negotiating with McNally, that he went downstairs, got in his car, a Cadillac, crashed through the fence at Lambert, got onto the runway, and drove right into the nose of the American airliner that McNally was negotiating with the FBI. The plane had just been refueled. If it had hit one of the wings, it would have blown the thing sky high.
I know, it's incredible. And that guy, David Hanley, later claimed to the Associated Press that he had no idea why he did it, and he had lost all memory, even of the inciting emotion that had caused him to do this. And there's always one other crazy aspect to this story. He's
lucky he survived, because it could have been turned out very much.
He was heavily injured, but he survived.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Back to Allen Barklage. Let's talk about the end. He was always tinkering with his toys, and he found one that turned out to be ill-fated. Obviously,
it's really tragic. Leading Allen Barklage was an aficionado of go-karts and a tinkerer, and from what I've been told, this helicopter that one would buy in a kit called the Revolution Mini 500. Several hundred were produced. Not all of them were made. They cost about $20,000 to $30,000. They were very, very light. They were single-seater. They did not have crumple zones as one would find in a car, but there were versions of that as well in helicopter landing gear. But it was extremely fragile. And he believed, because he had done so much tinkering with this go-kart engine, which shared mechanical similarities with the Rotex engine that was inside the helicopter. Unfortunately, as later investigations would show, this engine was not designed to be cranked at full power all the time, which is what a helicopter engine needs. I managed to find the owner's manual from the early 90s where it actually says this engine occasionally turns off. Do not use this engine if you ever have to make an unpowered landing. And anyone who's been in a helicopter, I think, knows in a similar way that a plane, even without its engine, you can glide it down to the ground if you have enough momentum. A helicopter can do something called auto-rotation, which again, is, as long as you have momentum, you can still use the air moving past your own rotors. Unfortunately, the error or the malfunction that occurred on September 19th, 1998, according to the later investigations, the engine just seized, and it appears that Allen tried to clear some power lines that were near there. And unfortunately, clearing those power lines used up the momentum he had, and the aircraft just dropped straight down to the ground without, the auto rotation, sort of the gliding sort of action that perhaps he was going for, and something that he specifically knew how to do and had trained people in. But it terribly injured his neck and his spine. He was in a medically induced, kept alive perhaps by medical technology for several more days, and then finally died on September 25th, 1998.
We're going to have to wrap this up, but we have a caller who maybe have something to add to the story. John in St. Charles. Go ahead, but make it quick, John, if you would.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention I was a charter pilot in my younger days. And during that period, the airplane got hijacked to Marion. I was able to fly the FBI negotiator, Mr. Flynn, to Marion, and I had no idea what was going on. And I flew the guys there and got to witness the entire thing behind the scenes.
Oh, wow. What an experience for you. Do you recognize the name Flynn, Danny?
No.
Okay. Interesting story, John. Thank you for bringing us into it. We have to go, I'm sorry to say, but thank you for giving us a call. Danny, would you like to have known Allen Barklage?
I would have loved to meet him. I think the combination of confidence that he had to have in his own abilities, but also the level of thrill-seeking. There was an element of exuberance and delight at the things that he could do in a helicopter and the way the world looked, and looking over the scrapbook that he kept, to get a sense of the things that were important to him. And there were these photos that he took of the arch, piercing the clouds above St. Louis, or the various helicopters he rode, and even the helicopters that were destroyed by, Viet Cong, gunfire, or another helicopter that had just almost exploded as it took off. But he kept these things with him because he saw part of himself in this machine and in that arena in the sky. And I would have loved just to hear him talk about what it would be like to fly, and what things he loved to do, or how he could make things that seemed so difficult or dangerous so easy, and to have so much fun doing it. And I think those are the things I wish I could hear him talk about today.
Take it from me, he would not have been reluctant to talk about flying. He loved to talk about it, and as I say, many people in the media knew him fairly well because he ferried us all around at one time or another, and frequently many times. Danny Wicentowski, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for your stories in the Riverfront Times, with photos as well, so some of the things we've talked about you can actually see. That's Danny Wicentowski of the Riverfront Times. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.